March 2008, two brothers from Chicago walked into a meeting with the Sinaloa cartel's top lieutenants. El Chapo trusted them completely. What he did not know was that every word spoken in that room was being recorded and sent directly to the DEA. October 2008. Two cartel-connected brothers from Chicago's little village are sitting inside one of El Chapo's inner circle meetings. But little did the Sinaloa cartel realize that these two men had already flipped, and what they handed the DEA over the next few weeks would bring down the most powerful drug lord in human history. These are 5 cartel members who became DEA informants. And what happened to each one of them when it was all over? Story number 5. Carlos Toro, a Colombian national who spent nearly 3 decades as one of the DEA's most productive informants in history, and then discovered that the agency had no intention of ever letting him go. Now, to understand why this story is different from anything else on this list, you have to go back to Colombia in the 1970s. Carlos Toro grew up in Medellin. As a young man, he developed a close friendship with a neighborhood figure named Carlos Later, who would go on to become one of the founding architects of the Medellin Cartel, alongside Pablo Escobar. By the mid-1980s, Toro had been pulled fully into the organization. He wasn't a sicario. He was a logistics coordinator, cutting deals with foreign officials, moving cocaine shipments, managing the financial end of an operation that at its peak was flooding the entire United States with product. At one point, $10 million per week was flowing through the attic of his own home. But here's what makes this story different. When Toro was eventually caught, he didn't just hand over a few names and take a deal. He went all in. He agreed to become a full DEA informant. And then he spent the next 27 years helping them. What Toro did over those 27 years was extraordinary. He helped the DEA apprehend money launderers and drug traffickers across multiple continents. He testified in open court against some of the most powerful men in the world, including Panamanian dictator Manuel Noriega. He traveled undercover, built cases, gave testimony that put major players behind bars, and in 2010, the DEA presented him with their Lifetime Achievement Award. But what really pushed things over the edge was when Toro, now 65 years old, told the DEA he wanted to retire. He wanted to go home. He wanted to spend the rest of his life with his wife of 35 years and their 2 children. That's when Toro found out what his arrangement had really been all along. Now you might be wondering, how does someone who won the DEA's Lifetime Achievement Award end up trapped? Well, here's what really went down. Toro's legal immigration status in the United States had never been made permanent. For years, the DEA had been issuing him a temporary immigration document, renewed annually, entirely at their discretion. The moment he stopped cooperating, that document would lapse. And the moment it lapsed, he was looking at deportation back to Colombia. And believe it or not, it gets worse. Because in Colombia, the cartels Toro had spent nearly 3 decades helping to dismantle were still operating. His name was known. His cooperation was on the record. Going back was not a retirement. It was a death sentence. Pop quiz. How many years do you think someone can serve as a DEA informant before the agency is required to grant them permanent legal status? Maybe you're thinking 5 years. Maybe 10 sounds fair. Let me tell you, there is no requirement. There is no number. The DEA can keep renewing that temporary document indefinitely. And in Carlos Toro's case, that's exactly what they did. Michael Levine, a 25-year DEA veteran, said it plainly. Agents are only interested in one thing, and that is numbers. They will use you until there is nothing left to use. As of the last available reporting, Carlos Toro remains in legal limbo in the United States, past the age he ever wanted to stop, with no clear path to the retirement he was promised. Little did Carlos Toro realize when he first agreed to cooperate that he wasn't signing a deal. He was signing his freedom away, just in a different direction than the cartel would have taken it. Story number 4. Humberto Loya Castro. And now the case that will genuinely mess with your head, because this next man wasn't a cartel soldier. He wasn't a logistics manager or a drug mule. He was El Chapo's personal lawyer. and he became one of the DEA's most valuable informants in history, while possibly never working against the cartel at all. Now, to understand why this was so significant, you need to know who Humberto Loya Castro was inside the Sinaloa organization. He was El Chapo Guzman's trusted legal advisor, a charismatic, educated Mexican lawyer who had direct access to the cartel's leadership. He sat in on strategy discussions. He knew the bribery networks. He knew where the money moved. In 1995, Loya Castro was indicted in San Diego alongside Guzman himself for narcotics trafficking conspiracy. And then something extraordinary happened. He was never arrested. He continued operating as a fugitive with an active federal warrant for years. And by the year 2000, while that warrant was still active, the DEA had already begun using him as an intelligence source. In 2005, he made it official, signing paperwork to formally become a confidential DEA informant. A wanted fugitive, a man with an open federal indictment, signing up to work for the same government that was supposed to be hunting him. But what really pushed this story into another level was what Loya Castro was actually providing. According to former DEA agents and court documents, his intelligence was not focused on the Sinaloa cartel, the organization he worked for. It was focused almost entirely on their rivals, the Tijuana cartel, the Arellano Felix brothers, the Beltran Leyva organization. His tips helped the DEA dismantle organizations that were in direct competition with Sinaloa. Every cartel that Loya Castro helped take down made El Chapo's organization more powerful. One former DEA official who worked directly with Loya Castro described him as a triple agent, not a double agent working for both sides. A triple agent working for the cartel through the DEA against the cartel's rivals. Now you might be wondering, how does something like this go on for years without the DEA realizing what was happening? And believe it or not, the answer is that some of them did realize. But the relationship continued, because his tips produced results. Arrests were made, seizures happened. The DEA had numbers to point to. And in an agency where agents are only interested in numbers, that was enough. Little did the lower-level DEA agents working this case realize that their most productive informant may have been running the entire operation for the benefit of the cartel. In 2008, the federal charges against Loya Castro, the same charges that had been active since 1995, were quietly dropped. No trial, no prison sentence, no public explanation. He simply walked. His current whereabouts are unknown. And the Sinaloa cartel, which he ostensibly worked for while informing for the DEA, grew during his tenure into the most powerful drug trafficking organization in the history of the world. Story number 3. The DEA Informants. Program costing people their lives. This next story is the darkest chapter in this entire video. Because the cartel members who became DEA informants in this case didn't just lose their own lives, their cooperation triggered one of the worst massacres in Mexican cartel history, and barely anyone in the United States ever heard about it. The year is 2011. Los Zetas, at the time the most feared cartel in Mexico, are at the peak of their power under two brothers, Miguel Angel Trevino, known as Z40, and his brother Omar, Z42. These two men commanded a cartel that was not just trafficking drugs. They were running extortion, kidnapping, human trafficking, and political corruption across entire Mexican states. The DEA had been trying to get inside the Zetas' leadership for years, and then they got a break. A high-level Zetas operative agreed to cooperate, and what he gave them was extraordinary: the trackable cell phone identification numbers for Z40 and Z42 themselves. The DEA could now follow the real-time movements of the two most wanted cartel leaders in Mexico. Now, to understand why what happened next was so significant, you have to understand one thing about working with Mexican federal police in 2011. The Zetas had been systematically infiltrating and bribing federal police units for years. Everyone inside the DEA who had worked in Mexico knew this, and several agents explicitly warned their superiors, do not share this intelligence with the Mexican Federal Police Unit. They leak. The warning was ignored. The DEA shared the cell phone intelligence with a vetted Mexican federal police unit, one they had trained themselves. Within hours, the information reached the Trevino brothers. Z40 and Z42 now knew someone inside their organization had betrayed them, and the source traced back to a small ranching town near the Texas border, Allende in the state of Coahuila. On the evening of March 18, 2011, Z40 sent the Zetas in. For 3 consecutive days, Zetas gunmen moved through Allende and its surrounding communities. They weren't just looking for the informants. They were rounding up anyone connected to those families. By blood, by name, by proximity. Cousins, neighbors, people who had never had any contact with the cartel or the DEA. Victims were taken to a ranch outside town, murdered, their bodies incinerated. There was almost nothing left to identify. Pop quiz. How many calls for help do you think the emergency line in Allende received during those 3 days? Maybe you're thinking a few dozen. Maybe a few hundred would sound extreme. Let me tell you, the emergency system received 1,451 calls. Not one was answered, because the municipal police of Allende were under Zetas' control. And in some cases, officers actively participated in the disappearances. And guess what? The destruction went on in fits and starts for weeks after those first 3 days. Entire blocks of Allende's main streets were demolished. Once prominent mansions burned to the ground. Rubble, children's toys, wedding invitations, scattered across the ruins of what used to be people's homes. The official Mexican government count of victims, 28. Researchers concluded the real number was close to 300. The exact toll has never been confirmed. Most of the bodies were never found. The DEA did not investigate the intelligence leak internally. When journalists finally confronted the agency years later, the DEA apologized and blamed the Zetas. The supervisor who made the decision to share the intelligence was later promoted within the agency. The 2 informants at the center of it all, their fates have never been officially confirmed. They are presumed dead. Little did those 2 men realize when they agreed to cooperate with the DEA that the agency's next decision would cost not just their lives, but the lives of potentially hundreds of people who shared their last name. Story number 2, El Vicentilo. Now the Zetas informants also paid with their lives, but this next man was born into a position that should have made him untouchable. His father co-founded the Sinaloa Cartel. El Chapo was practically family. And yet what he did, and what happened to him after, is one of the wildest stories in the history of the drug war. Jesus Vicente Zambada Nibla, known as El Vicentillo, born in 1974 into the Zambada family, which sits at the very top of the Sinaloa cartel. His father is Ismael El Mayo Zambada, the co-founder of Sinaloa, a man who to this day is considered one of the greatest criminal minds in the history of organized crime. El Vicentillo didn't choose the cartel. The cartel was his inheritance. By his late 20s, he was the organization's logistics coordinator, overseeing the movement of multi-ton cocaine shipments via cargo planes, freight trains, and submarines into the United States. He paid approximately $1 million per month in bribes to Mexican officials just to keep operations running without interruption. Now, to understand why his cooperation with the DEA was so significant, you have to understand what El Vicentillo had access to. He didn't just know shipment routes. He sat in rooms where the entire strategic direction of the most powerful drug cartel in the world was discussed. He knew the bribery structure up to the highest levels of the Mexican government. He knew how El Chapo moved. He knew how El Mayo thought. In early 2009, El Vicentillo's story took a turn that nobody saw coming. The Sinaloa cartel's lawyer, Humberto Loya Castro, arranged a meeting at the Hotel Sheraton in Mexico City between El Vicentillo and 3 DEA agents. On March 17, 2009, El Vicentillo sat down with those 3 agents. According to his own account, they told him he was protected, that an arrangement had been made at the highest levels of the U.S. government to assure his immunity from prosecution. Hours after that meeting ended, Mexican federal police arrested him. That's when El Vicentillo decided enough was enough. He started screaming from prison that the DEA had promised him immunity, that he had come to that meeting in good faith and been double-crossed. The U.S. government's response? We never promised him anything. The judge agreed, but here's what he did next. And believe it or not, it changed the trajectory of the biggest drug trial in history. El Vicentillo flipped. Formally, he pleaded guilty in 2013 and signed a full cooperation agreement. And then, at El Chapo's 2019 trial, he dropped something that sent shockwaves through two governments. He testified, under oath, in a federal courtroom, that former Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto had accepted a $100 million cash bribe from El Chapo. Personally, Mexico denied it, but El Vicentillo was on that stand, under penalty of perjury. Pop quiz: how many senior Sinaloa cartel members were indicted as a result of El Vicentillo's cooperation? Maybe you're thinking, 10, maybe 20 sounds significant. Let me tell you. His cooperation contributed to indictments against more than 50 high-ranking members of the Sinaloa cartel, including El Chapo himself. At his sentencing in 2019, El Vicentillo walked into the Chicago Federal Courthouse in a well-fitted gray suit, stood with his hands clasped behind his back, told the judge he had proven his repentance with deeds, not just with words. He was sentenced to 15 years, 2 fewer than prosecutors asked for. With time served, he was free around 2021, living somewhere in the United States under witness protection. His father, El Mayo Zambada, who co-founded the Sinaloa cartel and ran it for over 4 decades, was arrested in New Mexico in July 2025. The son who snitched is walking free. The father who built the empire is in federal custody. Little did the Sinaloa cartel realize when they sent El Vicentillo to that hotel meeting in 2009 that they were handing the DEA the key to their own front door. Story number 1. The Flores twins. Now El Vicentillo was cartel royalty who flipped. But what these next 2 men did was way beyond anyone's wildest imagination. 2 identical twin brothers from the west side of Chicago, who went from street-level dealers to the most valuable cartel informants in DEA history, who secretly recorded El Chapo himself, and who, when it was all over, heard a federal judge tell them they would spend the rest of their lives wondering if their car was going to explode when they turned the key. Pedro and Margarito Flores, born and raised in Chicago's Little Village neighborhood. As teenagers, they were street dealers, but by the early 2000s, they had built the largest drug distribution network in Chicago's history. At their peak, the Flores brothers were moving between 50 and 70 tons of cocaine into the United States every single year, working directly with El Chapo and the Sinaloa cartel, distributing product across Chicago, Columbus, Cincinnati, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. They sent $1.8 billion in cartel cash back to Mexico, wrapped in plastic and duct tape, packed into cars and suitcases. El Chapo trusted them completely. In the cartel world, that is both the greatest honor and the most dangerous position you can be in, because trust means access, and access means you know things that can destroy the organization if they ever get out. Now, to understand why what happened next was so significant, you have to understand the pressure that was building on the twins by 2008. On one side, the Beltran Leyva organization was squeezing the Chicago operation. On the other side, federal agents were closing in. The walls were moving in from every direction. In October 2008, Pedro and Margarito Flores made contact with the DEA through their lawyers. They were ready to cooperate, but what they offered the DEA went far beyond handing over a list of names and addresses. They proposed to keep working, to stay inside the cartel, taking meetings, moving product, traveling to Mexico, while feeding everything they saw and heard to the DEA in real time. A live wire inside El Chapo's inner circle. The DEA said yes. For weeks, the Flores twins continued operating as if nothing had changed. They attended cartel meetings. They took calls from lieutenants. They traveled south of the border. And during this period, they recorded 2 direct conversations with Joaquin El Chapo Guzman himself, the most wanted drug lord on the planet, in which Chapo discussed drug shipments, logistics, and operational plans, without El Chapo ever knowing he was being recorded. On November 30th, 2008, the DEA gave the Flores brothers 2 hours' notice. Get out of Mexico, right now. They flew back to Chicago with little more than the clothing they were wearing, and began cooperating fully from inside the United States. But here's what they didn't know at the time. During the cooperation period, Pedro's brother-in-law was kidnapped. The message was clear. The Sinaloa cartel knew what was happening. He was never found. He is presumed dead. Pop quiz. How many senior members of the Sinaloa cartel do you think were charged as a result of the Flores twins' cooperation? Maybe you're thinking a dozen. Maybe 20 sounds like a lot. Let me tell you, their intelligence led to indictments against El Chapo and more than 50 other high-ranking Sinaloa members. And Pedro personally testified at El Chapo's 2019 trial, telling a federal jury that he and his brother had imported 38 tons of cocaine and sent $800 million in cash from Chicago alone. And believe it or not, both their wives were also eventually prosecuted for hiding and spending drug money. The family they said they were protecting got pulled into the machine anyway. Because in a federal drug conspiracy, a verbal promise of immunity means nothing without a signed agreement. January 27th, 2015. Federal courthouse in Chicago. Bomb-sniffing dogs sweep the building. Extra armed officers on every entrance. Pedro and Margarito Flores walk in for their sentencing. First public appearance in over 6 years. The judge looks at 2 men who trafficked 70 tons of cocaine and sent $1.8 billion to Mexico, and calls them the most significant drug dealers he has dealt with in 2 decades on the bench. He sentences them each to 14 years instead of life because of the extraordinary nature of their cooperation. And then he says something that silences the entire courtroom. Even though I am not going to sentence you to life, you are leaving here with a life sentence. Each time you start your car when you are out of prison, you are going to be wondering, is it going to start or will it explode? The Flores twins were released around 2021. They are free men today, living somewhere in the United States under new identities. But their brother-in-law is dead. Their wives did prison time. And every single day for the rest of their lives, they will be looking over their shoulders. Little did El Chapo realize when he sat across from those 2 brothers from Little Village that the men he trusted most inside the United States were already recording every word he said and sending it directly to the people who would eventually put him away forever. And that's how the Flores twins, 2 brothers from Little Village, proved that the most dangerous man inside a cartel isn't always the one with the gun. Sometimes it's the one who's been quietly recording everything. 5 informants, 5 completely different fates. One was trapped by the agency he served for nearly 30 years. One may have been running the DEA for the cartel the whole time. One's cooperation triggered a massacre that killed close to 300 people. One dropped a $100 million bribery claim under oath and walked free. And 2 brothers from Chicago helped bring down the most powerful drug lord in history, and still can't start their cars without wondering. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more. And let me know in the comments, which of these 5 do you think made the smartest move? And which one paid the highest price?